So if you feel like the world is just, completely spinning out of control right now, you really aren't crazy.
Right. Not at all.
I mean, you turn on the news or you just look at your phone, and it is this constant, overwhelming barrage of chaos. It feels like every system we rely on is fracturing.
Yeah, it's like a fire hose of anxiety. Politics, the climate, technology, the economy, it all feels incredibly brittle.
Exactly. But what if the chaos you're watching isn't actually things falling apart? What if it's the sound of the world frantically, fundamentally reorganizing itself?
That is the exact reframe we need right now.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we have a truly fascinating new document on the table. It's an analytical text called The Intelligent Edge, a systemic reorganization of the world.
And it is a dense read, but so incredibly urgent.
It really is. And our mission for this conversation is to decode what it actually means for you, because this document proposes that these massive shifts we are living through, they aren't random, separate emergencies.
No, not at all. They are symptoms of one massive system-wide reorganization. And it's happening quietly, right beneath the surface.
So what's our starting point here? Because the author makes a pretty bold claim right up front.
Well, what's fascinating here is the author's core premise, which completely reframes that feeling of chaos you just described.
Okay, how so?
The text argues that the center of our world, meaning the traditional hubs of power, decision-making, institutional processing, it is losing its historical monopoly on intelligence.
Losing its monopoly on intelligence, that's a massive statement.
It's a profound structural shift in how the planet operates. And honestly, we are still struggling to find the vocabulary to even describe it.
I want to start by looking at how we used to think about the world, just to set a baseline, because historically there was this expectation of mechanical precision.
Right, the old clockwork universe.
Yeah, exactly. It was like a classic pocket watch. You take the back off and you can see exactly how it functions. This big economic gear turns that little political gear, cause and effect.
It was predictable, or at least we like to pretend it was.
Right. If a policy failed, you just pointed to the broken gear and fixed it. But the author starts right out of the gate by arguing that this pocket watch model is completely dead.
It's gone. We are entering what they call a dense planetary condition. And it's driven by this concept they call the Great Coupling.
The Great Coupling.
Okay.
Help us understand that mechanism. What exactly is coupling?
Think about the way a government or a large corporation traditionally solves a problem. They use a siloed approach.
Like separating everything into neat little boxes.
Exactly. If there's an economic crisis, you put the economists in a room to fix it.
Yeah.
If there's an ecological crisis, you deploy the environmental scientists. Supply chain issue, you call logistics.
Everyone stays in their lane.
Right. The foundational assumption is that these are distinct, parallel tracks. You can adjust the tension on one track without derailing the others.
But the text says that's an illusion now, right?
A total illusion.
Yeah.
We've reached a point of planetary complexity where these systems have essentially metabolically fused together.
Metabolically fused, meaning they are sharing the exact same bloodstream, basically.
Precisely. You cannot touch the technology system without immediately triggering a massive shockwave in the ecological system.
Which instantly impacts the political system.
Which alters the financial markets. They are tightly coupled into one dense condition.
Can you give us a concrete scenario just to really ground this for the listener?
Let's use a real-world example. Say there is a severe, unexpected drought in a specific region of Taiwan. Under the old model, that's just an ecological problem for the local agriculture sector.
Right, you just send in the local water management folks and deal with it.
But in a coupled system, that drought immediately impacts the semiconductor factories. They require millions of gallons of ultra-pure water to manufacture microchips.
Oh, wow. So the chip production just halts.
It halts entirely. And within weeks, automobile manufacturing plants in Germany and the United States have to shut down their assembly lines because they can't get the chips.
Wait, so a lack of rain in Taiwan shuts down an auto plant in Michigan?
Yes. And that triggers sudden localized economic recessions in those manufacturing towns. That economic anxiety translates instantly into political volatility.
Which probably shifts the results of a regional election.
Exactly. Which then alters the geopolitical stance of that entire nation. A lack of rain in one hemisphere dictates industrial and political outcomes in another almost instantaneously.
Because the gears aren't distinct anymore, the pocket watch has basically melted together into one big, highly reactive organism.
That's a great way to put it. And because these systems are so tightly coupled, the old way of managing them, trying to issue commands from a strong, centralized core, it's fundamentally breaking down.
The center just can't process that level of fused complexity fast enough.
It really can't. The latency is too high.
Hearing you describe this, I'm picturing like an evolutionary leap or maybe a divergence. The old command and control way of running the world feels like a dinosaur.
A dinosaur, I like that.
Right. It's this massive, bulky creature that relies entirely on one tiny brain housed in its head. And it's connected to this long, incredibly slow central nervous system.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, so every time the dinosaur's foot steps on something sharp, that signal has to travel all the way up the massive spine to the brain. The brain has to process it, decide what to do, and send a signal all the way back down to move the foot.
And by the time the foot actually moves, the situation has already changed entirely.
Exactly. The threat is gone, or it's worse. That maps perfectly onto what the author is describing. Right?
It maps perfectly. The dinosaur represents the deeply held assumption that order and intelligence only flow from a strong central core.
But the new emerging pattern the text describes, it sounds much more like an octopus.
An octopus, expand on that.
Well, I was reading recently about how an octopus actually has clusters of neurons, essentially mini brains distributed all throughout its tentacle.
Oh, right. They have highly distributed nervous systems.
Yeah. It doesn't rely entirely on the central brain in its head. A tentacle can touch a rock, independently realize it's sharp, and instantly pull away.
Or adjust its grip without waiting for permission or instructions from headquarters.
Exactly. The sensing and the reacting are happening locally, right at the edge of the animal.
Yes, and to take your octopus analogy a step further, think about what happens when that tentacle adapts to the environment. It isn't just reacting blindly.
It's actually thinking.
Right. It is processing localized data. That is the shift the text is highlighting. Intelligence is moving to the edges.
So we're seeing a transition toward distributed sensing.
Distributed sensing, local adaptation, and what the author calls weak link coordination.
Weak link coordination, meaning they don't need a rigid hierarchy to work together.
Exactly. The system is realizing that to survive a dense, coupled environment, it needs intelligence distributed throughout the entire network, not just hoarded in the skull.
I see the logic there, but frankly, I have to challenge this a bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Because if my city is hit by a massive, unprecedented flood, I don't want a localized network of neighborhoods having a decentralized debate about what to do next.
That's a very fair point.
I want FEMA. I want a massive, centralized authority with unlimited resources to step in, take charge, and impose order. Doesn't this text romanticize decentralization a bit too much?
It's a vital question. In a real crisis, don't we need the dinosaur's brain?
Yeah, don't we?
The author is actually very careful not to fall into the trap of utopian decentralization. The text provides a crucial caveat.
Which is?
This shift does not mean the center disappears. The head of the octopus is still very much there, and it still serves a vital function.
Okay, so the federal governments, the corporate headquarters, the central banks, they aren't evaporating.
No, not at all. The shift is that the center is no longer the only place where computing, sensing, and reacting happen.
It's losing its monopoly.
Exactly. It's losing its monopoly on intelligence. The dinosaur model assumes the foot is completely dumb without the head. The new reality is that more of the world's actual processing is being forced out to the edges.
Where the interaction with the environment is actually taking place.
Think about technology. For the last 2 decades, the trend was to push everything into a massive centralized cloud. Your device was just a dumb terminal.
Right. Everything lived on a server farm in another state.
But now we are seeing a massive push toward edge computing. Your phone, your car, your local sensors, they are doing complex AI processing right there on the device.
They are the intelligent tentacles.
They are. Because if a self-driving car has to send a signal to a cloud server 1,000 miles away to ask if it should brake for a pedestrian.
And wait for the answer to come back.
Yeah. The latency alone makes it incredibly dangerous. The tentacle has to think for itself to survive.
That makes a ton of sense. And the text argues that this same principle applies to ecology, to social behavior, and to governance.
It's a universal pattern across all these coupled domains.
But, institutions and power centers don't just willingly give up their monopolies.
They absolutely do not.
The dinosaur doesn't just decide to evolve into an octopus because it sounds like a neat idea.
Yeah.
If this distributed intelligence is taking over, it must be because the old centralized model is failing under very specific stress.
It is being violently forced to adapt.
Right. And the author outlines exactly what is forcing it. They identify 5 distinct pressures that are tightening around the system simultaneously.
And we really need to examine the mechanisms of these pressures because they aren't 5 random, unrelated crises.
They're connected.
Deeply connected. The text makes it clear that these are essentially the same structural problem wearing different costumes. They're the friction points where the old silo-based systems are grinding against the new coupled reality.
Let's take our time and walk through these one by one. Because if you were listening to this, I guarantee you were feeling the weight of these pressures in your day-to-day life.
You're definitely feeling them, even if you've never had the systemic vocabulary to name them.
So the first pressure the text identifies is that energy and compute are becoming real, unavoidable strategic constraints.
For a long time, the centralized logic operated under the assumption of infinite scaling.
Meaning, just throw more resources at it.
Right. If your bureaucratic process gets too slow, hire more people. If your software requires more processing power, just build a bigger data center.
But we can't do that forever.
No. We are now slamming into the physical limits of the coupled field. Take the current explosion of artificial intelligence.
Everyone's talking about AI right now.
And the central assumption was that we would just build increasingly massive, centralized AI models housed in gigantic server farms, the ultimate centralized brain.
But the amount of electricity and cooling required to run those centralized models is astronomical, isn't it?
It's staggering. We are reaching a point where a single data center demands the equivalent power of a mid-sized city.
Wow.
The power grid, the actual physical infrastructure of the planet, simply cannot support the infinite scaling of centralized compute.
So the center is discovering a hard physical ceiling.
Yes. It simply cannot hoard all the compute and energy it needs to maintain absolute centralized control. The physics of the situation are literally forcing the processing out to the smaller, more efficient edges.
It's an actual metabolic limit. You just cannot feed the dinosaur enough calories to sustain a brain that big.
That's exactly it.
Okay, that makes complete sense on a physical level. But the second pressure is more about human organization. The text calls it governance latency.
Governance latency. Yeah.
It argues that our institutions are fundamentally slower than the systems they are trying to manage. When I read this section, a very specific image came to mind.
Oh, what was that?
It's like someone trying to act as the referee for a high-speed 64-player fiber optic video game. But the referee is using a 1990s dial-up modem.
Oh, that is incredibly accurate.
Right. The players are moving at the speed of light, and the referee is sitting there waiting for a static-filled image of the battlefield to load line by line.
That dial-up analogy captures exactly what we are witnessing globally. Governance latency and the widening gap between the exponential speed of a crisis and the procedural speed of a bureaucracy designed to handle it.
Because bureaucracies are designed to be slow, right?
Exactly. Think about what our legacy institutions, legislatures, regulatory bodies, international courts were designed to do. They were built for deliberation.
They required debate, consensus building, committee reviews.
Right, and impact studies. That was a feature, not a bug, in an uncoupled world. You wanted them to be slow so they wouldn't make rash decisions.
But the systems they are tasked with managing today do not wait for consensus.
Not at all. Financial algorithms execute thousands of trades a second. Viral social movements can topple a local administration in 48 hours.
And coupled climate hazards cascade across borders in a single weekend.
Yes. By the time a central legislative body drafts a bill, debates it, passes it, and issues a directive, the reality on the ground has already mutated 3 times over.
So the dial-up modem is functioning exactly as it was built to function, but the game has completely outgrown it.
Exactly. And the text points out that this latency is a profound pressure point. Because when the center cannot react fast enough to protect or organize the edges are forced to figure it out for themselves.
Which feeds perfectly into the third pressure, trust fragmentation. The text observes that people are increasingly routing around official central structures.
Routing around them, yes.
And my initial thought when reading that was to view it through a lens of malice or, deep political polarization.
That's a common initial reaction.
But is that what the author's getting at? Are people abandoning the center because they hate it, or simply because the structures are too slow to be useful anymore?
It's mostly the latter. If the dial-up referee can't keep the game fair, the players are naturally going to start making up their own rules in the chat.
That is the crucial distinction the text makes, isn't it?
Yes. While there is certainly ideological polarization in the world, if you look at it from a systemic view, trust fragments largely as an adaptive response to that governance latency.
Trust is basically a measurement of reliability.
Exactly. When the center repeatedly fails to deliver timely, relevant feedback or protection, trust evaporates, and people look for workarounds.
Give me a concrete example of what routing around the center actually looks like in practice.
Look at the energy sector. If a central state-run power grid becomes notoriously unreliable due to aging infrastructure or extreme weather.
Say rolling blackouts become the norm.
Right. Neighborhoods don't just sit in the dark waiting for the centralized utility to fix its bureaucracy. Those that can afford it will route around the failure by building local solar microgrids.
They coordinate with their immediate neighbors to share battery storage.
Yes, they become a tentacle.
Uh-huh.
Or look at finance. If the central banking system in a volatile region feels too slow, too exclusionary, or subject to hyperinflation,
What do they do?
people route around it using decentralized finance networks or local community currencies.
So they aren't necessarily doing this as a grand ideological rebellion against the concept of a state.
No,
Well,
they are engaged in a desperate search for functional pathways. When the center becomes a bottleneck, the edges figure out how to bypass it just to survive.
a search for functional pathways. That entirely changes how I view the fragmentation we are seeing. It isn't just chaos, it's an attempt at functionality.
Exactly, it's adaptation.
But if people are abandoning the center to build all these local networks and functional pathways, it creates a new problem. Which brings us to pressure number 4, attention strain.
This is a big one.
Suddenly, you don't have one official news source or one official directive. You have 10,000 local feeds and inputs. The text says signal is becoming much harder to distinguish from ambient noise.
This is perhaps the pressure we feel most acutely on an individual physiological level.
Oh, absolutely. I feel it every time I look at a screen.
In a centrally commanded, siloed system, information flowed primarily down from the top. It was highly curated.
You watched the evening news, read the morning paper, and that was it.
But in a coupled, distributed system, information is flowing from everywhere all at once. Because the center is losing its monopoly on intelligence, it is also losing its monopoly on broadcasting.
Every edge, every tentacle, every sensor is generating massive amounts of data.
And we simply don't have the biological hardware to process it.
You open your phone, and it is a fire hose of urgency. Your local weather alert is mashed up next to a geopolitical crisis,
Which is right next to an alert about your bank account.
which is right next to a viral video. Every notification is formatted to feel like a severe emergency.
Because everything is coupled, your brain is trying to calculate the cascading effects of all of it simultaneously.
And it is impossible to tell what actually matters to your immediate survival.
Precisely. We are suffering from massive attention strain because we are applying old linear filtering mechanisms to a fundamentally new density of information.
The noise floor has just risen so high.
It's risen so high that the actual vital signals, the faint early warnings of systemic shifts, are being completely drowned out by the static. Our cognitive architecture is buckling under the weight of the coupled field.
And the final pressure grounds all of this in the physical Earth itself. The text points out that coupled climate and hazard conditions are severely tightening the system.
Right. The old model assumes that a hazard is a localized event. A hurricane hits a coast. The coast deals with the hurricane.
But in the dense planetary condition, as we discussed with the Taiwan drought example, there are virtually no purely local hazards anymore.
The shocks travel through the coupled field instantly. A climate anomaly disrupts a specific crop, which spikes global commodity prices,
Which triggers mass migration.
which destabilizes a border zone.
Yeah.
The need for shared sensing across all these domains becomes existential. Yet our institutions are still structured to treat them as isolated incidents.
So let's pull all these threads together. We are looking at a world hitting a physical ceiling on energy and compute. We have institutions that operate like dial-up modems in a fiber optic world.
Right.
We have populations abandoning central systems to find their own functional pathways. We have human brains buckling under the noise of a million local sensors. And we have physical climate shocks ricocheting through the global supply chain instantly.
That is the tightening system in a nutshell.
So the obvious question is, how do you coordinate a living system under that much pressure? Over-centralizing gives us the dinosaur that can't react fast enough.
And letting the center completely collapse gives us pure, uncoordinated chaos.
Right. So what is the systemic response to these 5 pressures?
The systemic response is what the author identifies as a fundamental shift in the underlying logic of the world. The system is trying to save itself by abandoning the old rules of engagement.
What are the new rules?
We are witnessing a transition from command and control logic to relation and feedback logic.
Command and control to relation and feedback. Let's really dig into the mechanics of that. In the real world, what does that transition actually look like?
Well, in a command and control structure, the flow of intelligence is strictly one way.
The center gathers data, synthesizes it, makes a decision, and transmits a command to the edge.
Exactly. And the edge's only job is to execute the command. It's highly efficient in stable environments, but as we've established, it is disastrously slow in a dense coupled condition.
So relation and feedback logic flips this.
It completely flips it. The edge actively senses its immediate environment, adapts to it in real time, and then feeds that adaptation back into the broader network.
So other edges can learn and adjust without having to wait for a central directive.
Precisely. The intelligence isn't locked in a central vault. The intelligence emerges from the relationship and the continuous feedback between the parts.
You gave the example earlier of distributed AI and edge computing, where the device thinks for itself instead of relying on the cloud.
That's a perfect technological example.
The text also points to local ecological adaptation, right? Where farmers might be implementing incredibly specific soil strategies based on local microclimates.
Yes, and sharing that data via peer-to-peer networks rather than waiting for a federal agricultural mandate.
And the text points out a growing recognition across multiple disciplines that the most resilient systems, the ones that can survive the 5 pressures we discussed, are actually not the most centralized ones.
They aren't. Resilience comes from distribution.
Okay, let me pause you right there, because here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
It's incredibly easy to read this and think, oh, fantastic. Decentralization is the magical cure. Let's just push all power to the edges, let the tentacles do whatever they want, and that will save us.
Right, the utopian view.
But the author explicitly puts up a massive warning sign right here. They state point blank that this is not a romantic decentralization story.
They are very clear about that.
Distributed systems, they note, can fail terribly too. They just fail differently. I want to understand the exact mechanics of that. What does failing differently mean in a relation and feedback system?
Let's use the power grid analogy again, because it makes this highly abstract concept very tangible. Let's look at how a centralized system fails versus how a distributed system fails.
Okay, let's look at the centralized one first.
A centralized power grid is a marvel of command and control efficiency when it is operating normally. You have one massive nuclear or coal plant, and it pushes power out to millions of homes.
Right.
But it is inherently brittle. If that single central plant experiences a critical failure, or if the main transmission trunk line is severed by a storm, the entire city, millions of people, instantly goes dark.
The failure is catastrophic, total, and systemic. When it breaks, it just shatters.
Right. Now imagine a distributed grid based on relation and feedback. Thousands of localized microgrids, solar panels on residential roofs, local battery storage facilities, wind turbines at the neighborhood level.
All network together, sharing data and surplus power.
Exactly. If a severe storm hits that distributed grid, it is still going to cause damage.
Right. If a storm rips the solar panels off a dozen houses in one specific neighborhood, that neighborhood loses power.
And that is a real painful failure for the people living there. It's not a utopia. But the crucial difference is that the rest of the city stays online.
The failure is contained locally.
Furthermore, because the system operates on relation and feedback, the surrounding neighborhoods instantly sense the drop in power and can automatically route their surplus energy to the affected area to mitigate the damage.
A centralized failure is a shattering. A distributed failure is more like a tear in a net.
A tear in a net, that's a brilliant visual.
You can rip a hole in one part of a net and it's a real tear, but the net as a whole structure continues to hold tension. It doesn't instantly collapse into dust.
That is exactly the distinction the text is making. Relation and feedback systems are not immune to failure, but their architecture prevents local failures from becoming global catastrophes.
They are adaptable, whereas centralized systems are rigid. And as the coupled pressures increase, rigid systems become incredibly dangerous.
They become a liability to the whole field.
So if the net-like structure of relation and feedback is so clearly the better, more resilient logic for navigating a complex world, why does everything still feel so incredibly frustrating?
That's the billion-dollar question.
If this is the natural evolutionary step, why isn't the world just gracefully adapting? And that brings us to what the author addresses next. The legacy systems are not just quietly retiring.
The dinosaur isn't going gently into the night. It is fighting back.
The text calls these defensive mechanisms hardening patterns.
This is a vital part of the author's analysis. Whenever a massive systemic shift occurs, the institutions and the logic of the old era experience profound anxiety.
They realize they are losing control, but instead of adapting, they dig in.
They attempt to fortify the center. The text identifies 3 specific hardening patterns that actively block the system from learning and transitioning to the new logic.
Let's go through these, because I think everyone listening will recognize these behaviors in their own professional or civic lives. The first hardening pattern is extractive acceleration.
Extractive acceleration. Yes.
The text defines this as a system that stubbornly keeps scaling its old methods even when the underlying costs become glaringly visible.
This is essentially a refusal to acknowledge the new constraints of the coupled field, particularly the energy and compute constraints we discussed earlier.
It's the legacy system's core belief that if the old method isn't working, it just means we aren't doing it hard enough or fast enough.
It's the dinosaur trying to grow a massive second head instead of growing brains in its tentacles.
That is exactly what it feels like.
If centralized data processing is hitting a physical energy wall, extractive acceleration dictates that you don't redesign the software to be distributed and efficient.
Instead, you strip mine more resources.
You burn more fossil fuels, and you build an even bigger data center, regardless of the ecological devastation. It is an aggressive doubling down on the old logic.
It attempts to force the physical environment to conform to the system's needs, rather than adapting the system to fit the environment.
It is scaling purely for the sake of scaling, completely ignoring the metabolic cost to the whole.
That sounds incredibly self-destructive,
Right.
but the second hardening pattern feels less aggressive and more defensive.
Defensive is a good word for it.
The text calls it bureaucratic self-protection. It says this happens when institutions respond to overwhelming complexity by adding layers of process instead of increasing their responsiveness.
This is rampant in our institutions right now.
When I read this, I immediately pictured a struggling legacy corporation. Imagine a company whose core product is failing miserably on the market because consumers have moved on.
The customer base is sending a clear signal.
Right. But instead of going to the engineers, listening to the feedback, and completely redesigning the product, what does the CEO do?
What do?
They hire 3 new vice presidents of product strategy, and their only job is to write a 500-page report about why the product is failing, which requires forming 5 subcommittees, which takes 18 months.
They insulate themselves with process. That corporate example perfectly captures the mechanism.
It's so common.
It is. When an institution faces the governance latency we talked about, that terrifying realization that the world is moving too fast for it to control, its instinct is almost never to devolve its power to the edges.
Its instinct is to build a thicker, taller wall around itself to manage its own institutional anxiety.
It creates more compliance checks, more sign-off procedures, more oversight committees.
It basically generates the illusion of control.
Exactly. It makes the people inside the center feel busy and authoritative. But structurally, what is actually happening?
What is happening?
Every single layer of bureaucracy added is just another point of friction, another lag in the transmission of information.
By trying to protect itself from the chaos, the institution actually makes itself even blinder and slower.
Which further alienates it from the intelligent edges where the real adaptation is happening.
Which isolates them even further. And the third hardening pattern is perhaps the most visible one we encounter every single day, especially on social media or in politics. The text calls it narrative capture.
Narrative capture. This one is insidious.
It describes this as the tendency to reduce massive, coupled, complex problems into ideology-sized slogans. And I want to be really careful and clear here because the author isn't pointing fingers at any specific political side, left or right.
Right. The text is pointing at a systemic cognitive mechanism.
Why do humans do this? Why do we crush complexity into slogans?
We do it because the dense planetary condition is psychologically overwhelming. As we discussed with attention strain, human cognition has limits.
We just can't process it all.
When you are faced with a coupled crisis, say an economic downturn that is inextricably linked to an energy transition, a demographic shift, and a technological disruption, your brain simply cannot process all those variables and feedback loops simultaneously.
It induces a state of cognitive panic.
So as a defense mechanism, we engage in narrative capture. We take this impossibly complex, multidimensional reality and we forcefully crush it down into a tiny two-dimensional box.
We assign a clear hero, a clear villain, and a 5-word slogan to fix it.
Because a slogan is light. A slogan is easy to carry. A slogan does not require you to understand the intricate metabolism of relation and feedback loops.
But the text issues a severe warning about why these hardenings are so dangerous to our survival, doesn't it?
Think about what extractive acceleration, bureaucratic self-protection, and narrative capture all have in common.
They all do the exact same destructive thing to the system. They actively block learning.
They absolutely block learning.
Explain how a slogan blocks learning.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, intelligence requires a constant intake of new data. But when you reduce a highly complex problem to an ideology-sized slogan, you are essentially turning off your own sensors.
You've prematurely decided that you already possess the absolute truth, the final answer.
And once a system believes it has the final answer, it stops gathering data from the edge. It stops listening.
These hardenings make the world noisier exactly when it desperately needs to become more readable.
It's a tragic irony.
Wow. You turn off your sensors to protect your anxiety. So let's look at the board. We have brittle centers doubling down on extractive logic.
We have bureaucracies building massive walls of paperwork to hide from reality.
And we have populations screaming two-dimensional slogans at each other instead of engaging with the actual complexity.
It paints a pretty bleak, terrifying picture of the current state of things.
It sounds like the system is just going to harden until it completely shatters.
But the author doesn't stop there.
Thank goodness.
They argue that underneath all this loud, hardened panic, there are counter-movements. The text calls them faint openings.
And we must emphasize the word faint. The center's hardening patterns are incredibly loud. They dominate the headlines.
But the text points out that out at the edges, away from the spotlight, networks are quietly opening up entirely new ways of operating.
The author points to a growing, rigorous interest in distributed sensing.
We are seeing engineers and architects paying profound attention to energy-aware design, building systems that inherently respect the physical limits of the field rather than trying to power through them.
The text also mentions cross-domain thinking.
Yes, which is the direct structural antidote to the old siloed pocket watch approach. We are finally seeing genuine metabolic mergers of disciplines.
You have experts combining climate science with artificial intelligence,
Urban infrastructure with localized governance.
computational modeling with indigenous ecological practices. They are recognizing the coupling.
They're looking at the whole field.
And there is this one specific opening the author highlights that absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I read it. I had to read the paragraph 3 times.
I know exactly the one you mean.
They say there is a growing willingness in some avant-garde circles to treat silence, uncertainty, and non-closure as valid data.
The text explicitly states a system that can tolerate not knowing becomes more capable of actually sensing.
The author calls this realization a major civilizational threshold. So I want you, the listener, to pause and think about this in the context of your own life, your own workplace.
It's so counterintuitive to how we're trained.
We're so deeply conditioned to always have a take, to always have an answer ready. In corporate culture, saying, "I don't know," is practically a fireable offense.
It's seen as a weakness.
But I want to push back on the author's premise here. How does accepting "I don't know" suddenly make a system more intelligent? Isn't the very definition of intelligence having the right answer?
That is the core of the paradigm shift. In the old command and control logic, intelligence was strictly equated with certainty.
The central authority, the CEO, the politician, the lead scientist must know everything.
And they must project absolute, unflinching confidence. If the center admits it doesn't know, it fears it will lose its legitimacy and authority.
But in a highly complex, dense coupled system, projecting absolute certainty is almost always a lie, isn't it?
It is usually the result of narrative capture forcing a messy, chaotic reality into a simple, predictable box just to ease anxiety.
Let's apply this to a concrete scenario. Imagine a corporate boardroom facing a massive, unprecedented disruption in their supply chain due to a new technology.
Okay, setting the scene.
The CEO demands an immediate strategic plan. The VP of strategy knows they don't have enough data to understand how this new tech will actually play out. But they can't say that.
No, they'd be fired.
So they force a conclusion. They draft a massive confident plan based on old assumptions just to provide closure to the room.
What happens to the intelligence of that organization in that exact moment?
In that exact moment, the organization's intelligence plummets. Because if a sensor, whether that is a piece of technology, an institution, or a vice president of strategy, forces a premature conclusion just to resolve the psychological discomfort of uncertainty, it immediately stops gathering new data.
It assumes the investigation is over.
It assumes the map is complete.
It puts on blinders, it turns off the sensors, just like the slogan does. Precisely. But if a system can tolerate not knowing, if that executive team can look at a murky, chaotic situation and have the systemic courage to say, we are in uncharted territory. We do not have enough verified data to form a definitive conclusion yet. We must remain in a state of active, distributed observation.
That system remains open. It keeps sensing.
It deploys its tentacles to gather more local feedback. In this framework, silence isn't broken equipment. It is simply the honest absence of a verified signal.
And recognizing the absence of a signal is, in itself, crucial data.
It prevents the system from hallucinating patterns that aren't there just to feel safe. A civilization or an organization that can tolerate non-closure is one that can continuously learn and adapt.
That is incredibly profound. The dinosaur needs to know everything immediately so it can issue a command and feel powerful.
But the octopus can just let a tentacle rest lightly on an unfamiliar object, feeling the texture, gathering data, sitting in the uncertainty of, I don't know what this is yet, without needing an immediate plan of attack.
And this profound shift in what we consider data, the radical acceptance of uncertainty, leads directly to the author's ultimate realization.
It forces us to redefine what we have been getting wrong about the concept of intelligence itself.
Yes, and this brings us to a section the text calls What Was Missed. And I would argue this is the most important pivot in the entire document.
I agree completely. For decades, our civilization has been obsessed with a single, highly linear question. How powerful can intelligence get?
We look at the development of artificial intelligence, or the dominance of a superpower nation, or the market cap of a mega corporation.
And we measure success entirely by raw horsepower. We want the biggest, fastest, most powerful central brain.
Right. It's an arms race of raw capacity. Who has the most central control? Who can dominate the environment most effectively?
But the author states, unequivocally, that this is no longer the central question of our era. The real question, the existential question is, how much coordination can the planet support without tearing itself apart?
Coordination over raw power. That is a massive inversion of our priorities.
It has to be, because raw power without coordination is inherently destructive in a coupled system. Think about it systemically.
How so?
Having the most mathematically powerful AI in the world means absolutely nothing if the massive energy required to run it collapses your ecological baseline.
Right. And having the most powerful, aggressive economy means nothing if the resulting inequality and trust fragmentation completely destroy your social fabric.
The text suggests that the real unit of analysis moving forward is no longer the isolated technological tool, the isolated nation state, or the isolated company.
The only unit of analysis that matters now is the coupled field they form together.
It is the metabolism of the whole thing. You cannot change the flow of information without immediately affecting the level of trust.
You cannot change energy extraction without affecting local adaptation. They are inextricably linked.
Exactly. So if we accept this, if we accept that coordination is more important than raw power, and that the edges are more intelligent than the center, the author concludes by outlining what a global sensing practice should look like moving forward.
How do we actually navigate this? The text says we need to focus on tracking movement, rather than just fixating on isolated events.
We need to favor clear signal over the illusion of completeness.
We need to read the atmosphere and the conditions before we panic over the headline. We need to stay close to the edge where change actually first becomes visible.
And crucially, this sensing practice should not become a prediction machine. It shouldn't pretend to know more than it knows.
When I synthesize all of that, it sounds like the author is fundamentally telling us to stop trying to be fortune tellers, projecting certainty, and start being much, much better listeners.
That is a beautiful, precise distillation of the mandate. The era of the pundit, The loud central authority figure standing on a stage, projecting absolute certainty about how the future will unfold, is a relic of the old command and control logic.
The future is simply too dense, too coupled, and too complex to be predicted by a single brain in the center, no matter how powerful that brain is.
The value of our attention, as the text says, lies in coherent attention. It is about tuning our senses away from the screaming center and toward the quiet edges.
Because, as the author offers in their final sweeping observation, the most important structural changes in our world are no longer happening inside the legacy systems. They are happening at the boundaries between them.
The center is still loud, but the edges are becoming intelligent.
Let me say that again, because that is the entire thesis of this document right there. The center is still loud, but the edges are becoming intelligent.
That is where the actual adaptation to this new world is happening.
That is where the pressure of the coupled field is being felt and resolved. That is where the future is quietly organizing itself. We have covered incredible ground in this conversation today.
We really have.
We started with this image of a melting pocket watch-a-world moving from clear, isolated cause and effect gears to a dense, murky, metabolically coupled condition.
We explored how the dinosaur model of a loud commanding center is cracking under the immense pressure of physical energy limits, lagging, dial-up institutions, and overwhelming cognitive noise.
We saw how frightened bureaucracies try to hide behind endless paperwork and two-dimensional slogans to protect themselves from this complex reality.
But underneath all that noise and hardening, we found the octopus, the intelligent edges.
The localized network sensing, adapting, and feeding back vital information, equipped with the courage to sit in uncertainty and say, I don't know yet, I am still listening.
If there is one superpower you take away from this deep dive, it is the ability to recognize narrative capture, step back from the screaming center, and look at the whole coupled field.
And if we connect this grand systemic picture directly to your daily life, if it is true that the most important changes are happening at the boundaries between systems, at that intelligent edge, I would ask you to reflect.
Where is the edge in your own life? What quiet signals, what seemingly minor points of friction are you perhaps ignoring right now, simply because they aren't coming from the loud, demanding center of your profession or the center of your daily routine?
We are so deeply conditioned to fixate on the loudest alarm, the biggest headline, the mandate from the boss.
But maybe that persistent friction point at the absolute edge of your experience isn't just a nuisance. Maybe it isn't a problem to be swatted away with a quick slogan.
Maybe, just like in the broader world, that friction is simply the future quietly organizing itself, waiting for you to tolerate the uncertainty long enough to finally pay attention.
What an incredible thought to end on.
Thank you so much for bringing your curiosity and your time to this conversation today. Keep listening to The Edges.